Some of the issues in first language acquisition that we will revisit later with second language acquisition are the following. First of all, there's a difference between competence and performance. Competence is really a true ability to use a language, and we use the term communicative competence, which is the ability, to really understand real language, speak, listen, read, write. Whereas performance could just be something along the lines of being able to get a good grade in a language class without really being able to use the language. As far as first language acquisition, performance might be a child who can read aloud after using maybe phonics, but not really be necessarily a good reader in terms of understanding content, but seem to have kind of a perception of having that ability. Another term is comprehension versus production. And as we know, we can always comprehend more than we can actually produce, both with first and second language acquisition. Comprehension being the listening and the reading, and production being speaking or writing and actually producing the language. So of course it's very natural to build up a high ability to comprehend, sort of like a passive type of vocabulary versus an active vocabulary. In addition, nature versus nurture, this goes back to the question whether we are born with that innate ability to just absorb and pick up language, or whether language is just introduced to us by our family and our culture. And this has to do with, as we mentioned before, the concept of a language acquisition device, or an LAD, or the little black box. So now we have what we would call the innateness hypothesis in strong or weak versions. There's also universal grammar, which is the phenomenon with all languages around the world, that they tend to have similarities in terms of how they pronounce things, structure, having nouns and verbs, negatives, question formation. There's quite a striking similarity between all languages, which tends to support the idea that language is universal and innate to humans, which also is supported by the fact that other animals don't learn language with the complexity that we learn language. What is interesting is that children are exposed to a variable language sample. It's not like children are introduced to language systematically, like, for example, simple grammar to complex, or simple words to complex words. Usually children are exposed to a variety of sentences and phrases, some simple. Sometimes we do speak more simply to children, but children hear a lot of very advanced language happening all around them, and from all this input they begin to create their concept of the language. So it's not a very systematic approach. When we learn a second language, we tend to feel that, well, we have a whole curriculum and we have a kind of a simple to complex presentation of the language, but it's not really a very natural type of exposure, because in the real world, so to speak, we hear not only all different levels of language, but sometimes we hear grammatically incorrect language from our peers and parents, or slang or informal language. And even with all of that, children can somehow make sense of it all and develop the ability to use the language. Language is very connected to just being able to think and form concepts. So and in fact the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is an interesting hypothesis about how basically our culture determines the way we actually see the world, and sometimes even the way we think. And so depending what language you learn, what your first language is, could really have an effect on the way you see the world and the way you express things. And obviously there's a strong cultural connection to language, as we know. That's what's interesting about learning a second language is, of course, learning that second culture and possibly seeing the world from a very different viewpoint. When we learn a second language, we tend to imitate a lot, repeat after me. But when we learn our first language, surprisingly, children don't parrot or imitate their parents a lot. I mean, sometimes they do, but it's not a big part of the process. So this kind of brings into question whether it should be a big part of learning our second language, a lot of repeating and repetition and pronunciation practice. Again, when we learn a second language, we practice and practice and practice. Kind of practice makes perfect. The first language we don't consciously practice, we just are in constant use of the language. Although some people think it's interesting that children actually talk to themselves. It's as though they're just practicing the language, even if they don't have anyone with them at the time, as they talk to themselves in bed and things like that. Obviously, discourse is a term that has to do with basically conversation, expressing our ideas, maybe trying to influence someone, trying to get information, and it's that whole back and forth of language. And discourse, we know, is and conversation is like at the crux of language learning as well. Well, these are some of the issues that we can look at with first language acquisition, and we'll revisit again with second language acquisition.